So the PTB for the Tokyo Ghoul Chapter is here. A sentence that this time last year I was really not expecting to say. When this roadmap was first revealed in last year's anniversary, I was at least pretty sure that this solo killer chapter was going to be Jason Voorhees. But I guess that legal stranglehold is harder to break than I first thought. While we had the Attack on Titan cosmetic release a little while ago, Tokyo Ghoul marks our first ever licensed chapter based on an anime, and that's a huge and exciting surprise to drop out of nowhere with zero teasers or build-up. You know, aside from all the leaks that have been pointing towards Tokyo Ghoul for months now. Yeah, if you were in the know, this chapter was not what you'd call a surprise. Tokyo Ghoul has been Dead by Daylight's worst kept secret for the past several months. But a lot of people doubted it, or were uncertain about what it might offer, because a lot about this IP is just very out of left field. And that left players with a lot of questions. How would our first anime and manga inspired chapter adapt the 2D anime art style into DBD's gritty attempt at 3D realism? How could Kaneki, the main protagonist of the show, fit in alongside horror's greatest villains? Could behaviour nail the shift from a brutal but typically well-intentioned anti-hero to a killer in the entity's service, or would it feel jarring? These are the kinds of questions we'll be answering today. We'll be going through Kaneki's lore in Dead by Daylight and the other ways his character is integrated into the game, and holding it up to the source material to see how well it lines up, and what it might imply for Kaneki's relationship with the entity and wider DBD universe. Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers, to Ken Kaneki and the Tokyo Ghoul Chapter. So, let's begin with the two burning questions that we need to answer to fully make sense of what Tokyo Ghoul is all about. Question 1. What's a Tokyo? Let me just... Oh, that makes sense. Oh, okay, yeah, I get it. And that just leaves us with one burning question. Question 2. What's a ghoul? In the world of Tokyo Ghoul, humanity is split between normal humans and a carnivorous subspecies known, surprisingly, as ghouls. Most of the time, ghouls look just like you and me, with the only obvious clue being these red and black eyes that come out when things are about to get feisty. If you see in those eyes, I'd tell you to run, but it's probably too late by then because ghouls are way faster, stronger and more durable than humans and can only sustain themselves by eating the flesh of humans or occasionally other ghouls. Wait, hang on, aren't those just edgy Japanese vampires? They sure do sound like vampires. Wait. I don't mean that like it's a bad thing. I like vampires, I talked about that before. Let's just carry on. Some ghouls are solitary, others exist in secret societies, enclaves or gangs, but all of them fear the intervention of the CCG, a government organisation dedicated to stamping out the threat that ghouls present to the normal human population. This is the world Kaneki is born into. He's a normal human boy, preyed upon by the ghoul serial killer Rize the Binge Eater, who thinks he'd make a nice snack, but the two are crushed by a falling beam before she's able to finish the job. Wait a second, that's a fucking metal pipe sound. Kaneki winds up receiving multiple organ transplants from Rize, turning him into a half-ghoul, who suddenly has to find human flesh to eat so he can survive. The first season of the show is all about this shock to the system, as Kaneki integrates himself into ghoul society. He takes refuge at a coffee shop, where he slowly learns the basics of how to ghoul, feeding on suicide victims, learning to fight, and hiding his identity with a custom-made mask. But when the gang leader Yamori learns of the incredible regenerative abilities of the half-ghoul, he kidnaps him and subjects him to almost 2 weeks of torture, snapping off enough fingers and toes to fill a bucket every day, and watching eagerly as Kaneki regenerates every wound. While Yamori breaks him physically and psychologically for 10 straight days, Kaneki has visions of Rize which confront him with the painful truth of his situation. He's spent his entire life trying to be inoffensive, unobtrusive, kind, and above all, pacifist. His mother always taught him that it is better to be hurt than to be the one who hurts others, and it was that attitude that led him here, being tortured to death in Yamori's clutches with little hope of escape. When Yamori prepares to finish the job, Kaneki escapes his bonds and easily dispatches Yamori, before giving him a painful and humiliating taste of his own medicine as he devours his Kagune and leaves him for dead. This is where Dead by Daylight picks him up. Kaneki moves to leave the theatre he was held prisoner in, and in the anime and manga he sets to work cleaning up the conflict and rescuing his friend Tuka. But in this version of events, the entity gets to Kaneki first. The young half-ghoul is taken from the Ward 13 theatre, and thus the entity claims Ken Kaneki, the ghoul, for its own. So, even at first glance, Kaneki's DBD lore is a lot less brief than many other licensed characters. I hope we're long past the days of the tweets we got for the lore of the Resident Evil characters, but it's important to note that almost all of that lore is just summarising Kaneki's backstory in Season 1 of the show. It doesn't diverge at all from Tokyo Ghoul Season 1 story until the third to last sentence, and then it's just to have the entity pick him up from the theatre like finding a stray kitten on the sidewalk. I can definitely see what they were doing here. If you're a DBD player who knows nothing about Tokyo Ghoul, then Kaneki's lore gets the information across in a very concise and helpful way. Honestly, it kind of puts me out of a job. But this comes at the cost of not really exploring the Dead by Daylight part of Kaneki and Dead by Daylight. The best licensed lore in the game comes from characters with unique relationships with the entity that show these characters that we love operating in a whole new context. Look at Detective Tapp's tome that patched up a plot hole in the Saw movies that existed for over a decade, or Alan Wake, whose lore is woven so expertly into DBD's canon and themes it's like he was made for it. Kaneki's lore does not do this. It's just a retelling of Tokyo Ghoul Season 1, and this creates a problem. Kaneki marks the first time a licensed protagonist has made their way into the fog as a killer, which normally isn't a particularly protagonisty role to fill. For licensed characters especially, the game's ranks of killers are some of the most sick and twisted motherfuckers in the history of horror media, so to see Kaneki here, serving the same bloodthirsty deity as Michael Myers or Freddy Krueger or Pinhead, rest in peace King, it all just seems a bit off. In theory, he's meant to be a decently upstanding guy, brutal at times but ultimately fighting the good fight. But the entire story of Tokyo Ghoul is about crossing lines of morality to get what you want. And given Kaneki's history of suffering, it's surprisingly fitting that the entity gets to drag him across those lines kicking and screaming. The entity rubbing off on Kaneki and allowing him to fully indulge a bit of a mean streak as a killer makes more sense than you might think, because throughout Tokyo Ghoul, and especially in late Season 1, Kaneki is an ultimately good person who nevertheless takes a lot of influence from the most harmful people he encounters in his life. Kaneki's story begins when he's attacked by Rize the Binge Eater, a ghoul serial killer whose organ transplants turn Kaneki into a half-ghoul. But it's not just her organs he assimilates. He also gains the use of her Kagune, and numerous characters comment on his similarities to her, mostly her smell. A hallucination of Rize even appears to Kaneki in moments of peril, tempting him to give in to his darker impulses, act selfishly or hurt those who need to be hurt. In that respect, he inherited both his nature as a ghoul and his eventual violent path from the serial killer who first targeted him. His torture session with Yamori later on cements that shift to a darker and more violent person. Kaneki spends 10 days being mutilated physically and psychologically, and walks away having picked up many of Yamori's habits. He cracks his knuckles just like Yamori did, a trait which he in turn picked up from his torturer, and winds up eating Yamori's Kagune to empower himself further. Tokyo Ghoul is the story of a cycle of violence between ghouls and humans, one that Kaneki ends up becoming a part of in order to try to stop it, and that process turns him closer and closer to the monster he originally thought all ghouls to be. The entity casting its shadow over Kaneki in his DBD lore takes that one step further, because all throughout Tokyo Ghoul it's clear Kaneki's biggest limitation is less his raw strength, but more his willingness to cross certain lines. He might have to cannibalize his fellow ghouls to gain their strength, or perform acts so destructive his own humanity chips away, but if that's a cost he's willing to pay, there's not a lot that he can't achieve. The entity is on a whole different level to anything Kaneki has ever encountered before. It's a great force of immortal evil and hunger that spans universes. No amount of cannibalism, hype background music, or 11th hour anime protagonist powers will bail him out of this one. Like a white rag used to clean up an ink spill, the evil of the world stains Kaneki and doesn't wash out easily. But there's way more in the fog than Kaneki could ever clean up, and it's no surprise that he bends to the entity's influence before he breaks. I think this is what Behaviour and the Tokyo Ghoul rights holders wanted to go for when writing Kaneki into DBD's world, but it just doesn't come across in the writing at all. In a piece of PlayStation blog, a senior copywriter at Behaviour, Mitch Findlay Brown, had this to say about Kaneki's shift into a killer.
Given his importance to the world of Tokyo Ghoul, it was important to ensure Kaneki remained the centerpiece of our chapter. Rather than making him a survivor, as his moral compass in the series may suggest, we felt it would be more interesting to really lean into the horror and present an alternate reality where Kaneki became exactly what he feared. While such a drastic change to Ken Kaneki's personality was necessary to suit his role as the killer, it allowed the team to delve into a ghoul's powers and take them to their darkest possible conclusion. Luckily, the Tokyo Ghoul production committee was on board for the story we wanted to tell, sharing our excitement to see this terrifying take on their protagonist.
I don't mean this as too much of a diss, but what story did you want to tell exactly? Because this isn't your story. This is just Tokyo Ghoul's story with the entity stapled on at the end like an afterthought. You had the components here to tell a story that cut to the bone of what Kaneki is about, and show how the influence of the entity could affect someone like him when they spiral out of their control in their darkest hour. The tools were there to tell this story, but Behaviour just didn't do it. Whether the license holders didn't want to, or they just couldn't be bothered, I don't know. But there's definitely an opportunity here that has been missed. It's a real shame because Kaneki occupies a unique position among our licensed killers. Not someone who is brought to the fog for his brutality, but who is instead goaded into brutality by the entity, to the point that a lot of people before and after the announcement claimed that Kaneki would not be a suitable killer for the fog. After all, he is the protagonist. Not necessarily the nicest guy ever, but with ultimately good goals. Doesn't tend to hurt people he doesn't have to. He won't necessarily avoid it either, but compared to all the other bags of assholes in the setting, that practically makes him Mother Teresa. But it's important to remember a lot of DBD's original killers are depicted in fairly similar ways. A lot of them, if not a majority of them, are victims of circumstance. People who, through misfortune or the cruelty of others, have been pushed into the role of the killer for understandable or even sympathetic reasons. Kaneki spends the first season of the show just trying to live his life, study hard, and maybe muster up the courage to talk to his crush, but through the cruelty of Rize, Yamori, the CCG and others, he's pushed into a cycle of violence and brutality. It is better to be hurt than be the one hurting others. That's the mantra that Kaneki grew up with, that he has to unlearn by the finale, and that arc of taking what you deserve by lashing out at those who've done you wrong is reminiscent of the hillbilly. Max Thompson Jr. spent his entire life under the thumb of his abusive parents and the corrupt cops who enabled them, and his Tome story especially portrays his breakout with a mixture of glorious catharsis and pretty disturbing violence that reminds me a lot of how Kaneki acts when he goes off the deep end after Yamori's torture. But I think an even better comparison is Kaneki's immediate killer predecessor, Portia May, better known as the Houndmaster. Much like Kaneki, Portia started out as a well-read teenager with a bright future as a young woman of privilege in fortune. But a random act of cruelty by the pirate Mad Mollak saw her marooned on an island. Portia had lost her father, her home, and her future. The only thing she had left was a burning desire for vengeance against Mollak, and an unnatural bloodlust that's implied to be the entity manipulating her trauma response. And over the course of years, Portia turned that drive into a lifetime of plunder and violence on the high seas. She fights her way to the top, but ultimately gives up everything all over again, in pursuit of Mollak. She never returns to her home in Fortune. She loses most of her crew to a mutiny, and she even has to leave her loyal companion snug behind to escape the island. She casts aside everything she worked for, everything she loved, to make Mollak pay, to finally satiate that bloodlust, and maybe, just maybe, finally know peace. Kaneki's story, at least at the start, follows a surprisingly similar path. Rize takes on Mollak's role as a random act of cruelty, robbing him of his normal life, and starting him on a path of violent bloodthirst, except a bit more literally this time. He's forced to leave versus his friend Hide, and then the team at the antique coffee shop behind, discard his pacifist principles and even shatter his sugar-coated memories of his late mother to survive in the harsh world he's thrust into. And he takes to his new uninhibited existence by treating the pointlessly cruel Yamori to a bit of violent payback. What I'm really trying to say here is that Kaneki had potential for a seriously interesting story, and if Behaviour followed through on that potential, we could have had one of the best licensed stories in DBD history. But as it stands now, I just feel kind of blue-balled. I'm not even saying this from the point of view of a Tokyo Ghoul fan either. I watched the show and read some of the manga in preparation for this chapter, but all that means is that the lore has almost no value to me, because 99% of it is just retelling season 1 of the show. If you already know or like Tokyo Ghoul, this backstory has nothing for you worth reading, and it's down to the rest of Kaneki's implementation into the game to pick up the slack. Fortunately, I'd say the rest of Kaneki's design and integration rises to the challenge for the most part. By far the most impressive part here is the modern adaptation of Kaneki's anime design into Dead by Daylight. Because while we have had anime collabs before like Attack on Titan and the works of Junji Ito, this was our first ground-up anime killer, so anything could have gone wrong. When this chapter was mentioned by Matthew Cote in his interview with The King and Paulie Esther, Cote said that the license was something new and kinda strange that would piss some people off. And looking back on it, yeah, that checks out.
Like, some people are gonna bitch, like, as usual, but it's gonna create some really interesting conversation. For sure.
Huh. All right.
Yeah. Let's talk about this again next year.
Okay. We talk about
Fair enough.
We'll talk about this one next
how we feel about it a year from now.
There's a significant amount of backlash pushing back against Tokyo Ghoul and Dead by Daylight, just on the principle of it being a manga or an anime. But speaking as someone who's never found an anime I enjoyed enough to watch out of anything other than obligation, I find this attitude to be kinda sad, frankly. Now the official release is here, I can comfortably say I've known this was coming for ages now, even before the leaks are public, and that's given me time to get used to the notion of Tokyo Ghoul and Dead by Daylight, to read the manga, to watch the show. I had no expectations going into it, and even though I didn't exactly love what I saw, I can still see the value in this chapter's existence. Whether you like it or not, Tokyo Ghoul is very different from DBD's prior chapter releases, and there's plenty that the Behaviour team were able to do that nothing else could ever have let them try. The adaptation of the anime art style into DBD's 3D rendering was the part I was most unsure about. With the sole exception of Castlevania, all of DBD's licensed content has been based either on live-action performances or media animated with realistic art styles. But it's been done fantastically. Kaneki's model, and especially the animation of the Kagune, blends effortlessly to DBD's realistic art style. His animations in general are first-rate. His multiple different weapon wipe depending on his enraged state are a wonderful touch, especially with him cracking his knuckles, and his Mori is beautifully evocative of his torture scene with Yamori at the end of Season 1. Everything from impaling the victim through the hands to the "What's 1000 - 7" quote really reminds you that escaping Yamori was the last thing he did before the entity took him. I guess old habits die hard. The power is also a pretty faithful adaptation of Kaneki's strength, toned down for the limitations of the trial, of course. Kaneki's always been physically strong and lethal, but even before he discovers how to use his Kagune, he naturally favours an evasive fighting style. A mobility power where he leverages his Kagune and nimble frame is only fitting for this kind of character. I might have a recent history of ragging on dash killers a lot, but I will concede, there is nothing they could have done to fit this character better. Outside of the lore though, I think the only part of Kaneki artistically that felt a little disappointing has been Kaneki's voice work. Which is surprising when you learn that the original Japanese VA for the character, Natsuke Hanai, is back to voice Kaneki for DBD. Sadly, I can't help but feel he's a little wasted here, because after killers like Chucky and Houndmaster who can't stop yapping in and out of trials, Kaneki feels like a bit of a step back. Pinhead, Leviathan rest his soul, started the trend of killers with an array of voice lines in the trials, and barring Xenomorph, every licensed killer since him, and some originals, have been fully voiced in the trials, Mori, and menu. Kaneki has some of these, but not as many as you might think. He has a few voice lines in the lobby menu and always says the same line in his Mori, but he has no voice lines in the trial itself. Instead he just sort of grunts and screams a lot, and I mean a lot.
Oh!
Maybe Natsuki Hanai was not feeling well enough to do some in-trial voice lines because he ruptured his appendix by going "Ugh! Ah!" for 5 hours straight. If the upcoming Rize Legendary skin changes these grunts to make them more bearable, it's an instant buy for me if I wind up playing Kaneki enough to justify it, because the grunts are so distracting. Although it at least affirms the voice actor was giving 110%. Normally, here's where I would wrap up about the character, and do the like and subscribe YouTube ritual and all that jazz, but there's a fairly conspicuous absence in this release that I'm quite surprised at. Kaneki releases as a solo killer with an original survivor coming in May. And while I'm looking forward to another original character, the lack of a Tokyo Ghoul survivor here feels like a missed opportunity. The CCG is an entire organisation of badass normals with a shaky relationship with morality, and it's full of potential survivors who occupy the same moral grey area as Kaneki himself. Amon is probably the most important person in the story short of Kaneki himself, and his entire thing is being outmatched by superhuman foes out to kill him. Without his Kinke, it would be realistic for him to be running from the horrors of the fog. It's not like he's too powerful for the killers or anything, but it seems like an absolute no-brainer to have him or someone else from the CCG like Akira or even Juzu standing opposite Kaneki as a survivor. Don't get me wrong, I think I prefer it this way since we're getting that original survivor in May that I'm really excited for, but if I was a Tokyo Ghoul fan, I'd probably feel a bit robbed at the lack of a survivor for this chapter. And herein lies my final stance on the Kaneki release as a whole. It is in basically every respect a solid but unexciting licensed chapter. It doesn't really do much wrong, and where it nails it, it really nails it, like the animations and the power design, but that doesn't make it exciting or memorable for me. The lore is sufficient but tells us nothing. The voice lines are technically present, but a substantial step down from the last year or so of killer releases. And even the power is a real crowd pleaser when it works, but at the end of the day it's just another distance denial dash killer in an environment that's already massively oversaturated with them. It's not a bad chapter by any means. Just one I won't really be remembering much once the release window passes. Full disclosure though, unlike my favourite killer, I am very much not an anime enjoyer. I am about as far from the target audience for this chapter as you can get. I've never actually finished any season of any anime, except as an obligation to a friend who's recommended it to me, and Tokyo Ghoul is unfortunately no different. It's not one thing that doesn't vibe with me, it's a mixture of stuff, like the art style not usually working out for me, or the tropes and dialogue choices that just make my head ache sometimes. Like, for every moment in Tokyo Ghoul where I was genuinely enjoying myself and appreciating the tension or the drama or the humour, there was another where I was just having my head in my hands because I couldn't take it. Oh wow, this guy Amon's being attacked by two powerful ghouls. I sure wonder what his cunning plan is that's been built up to in this flashback with his mentor. I wonder what his plan could be. Oh wait, his sword is secretly two swords and he kills them because that's what a plan is. It's when you have two swords. Wow, well done Tokyo Ghoul writers. I want to punch my monitor now. Thanks guys. But I'm only saying this because I want to affirm something. Just because this chapter didn't excite me doesn't mean it's a bad chapter, that Kaneki isn't a fitting killer, or that future anime collaboration shouldn't happen. My criticisms of the chapter themselves have nothing to do with it being an anime or being a piece of media I don't like very much. I just can't stand when DBD does things by half measures, that's all. If this chapter had properly fleshed out Kaneki's lore, let him yap properly in the trials like Chucky and Houndmaster, and maybe dropped a survivor in there too, I'd have a lot more positive things to say about the release. But from where I'm standing, the Tokyo Ghoul chapter is just kind of forgettable. And I am sick and tired of forgettable chapters. It's been so long since we've had a licensed killer I've really given a shit about. Hell, the last one I've really enjoyed is about to get removed from the game in April, and the original situation is not much better. Houndmaster is the only new original I've cared about in quite some time, and she basically got left to die on the vine as soon as she came out. When I first heard about Tokyo Ghoul coming to DBD right before FNAF, I accepted that the first half of 2025 would be basically a dead 6 months for me, but despite everything, I've at least enjoyed making this video and talking about Tokyo Ghoul. So it sort of exceeded my expectations in a way. At the end of the day, it's a series that means something, that tries to say something, and I'm always happy to talk about that, learn more, and gain insights from other people who like it. In every sense of the word, the Tokyo Ghoul chapter was an experiment, and despite me not loving the result, I can't really say that experiment was a failure. Anime collaborations can work in DBD, Tokyo Ghoul has proved that, and I hope if they do try it again, they can learn from the Tokyo Ghoul chapter. Both its successes and its failures. But please, if you're going to try another anime chapter, maybe give it a while. My Crunchyroll Premium free trial just expired. So that's all I have to say about the Tokyo Ghoul chapter. You've heard me yap for a while, so I'd like to hear what you think. Tell me what you reckon. Are the Tokyo Ghoul fans watching satisfied about how the chapter presented your character, or do you kind of wish there was a bit more there? Special thanks to my friend Joy, who voiced that little section from the PlayStation blog, and to Vexanair, the wonderful artist who did the render for this thumbnail. Both of them are absolute class acts. I've got Joy's Twitch in the description, and Vexenair's Twitter and Blue Sky as well, so please do go check them out. I have multiple videos that are sitting around half done, so expect them soon. Thank you everyone, and I'll see you next time. Ta-ta for now.